Hi everyone, this is Dragon GGY on the pursuit of operator release schedules. I'm late again, but here it is, Operator Hindsight for Nymph. Let's get into it. Nymph is a 6-star primal caster in the caster class. Trait of the archetype, attack deals arts damage and can inflict elemental damage, which honestly is not that complete because they can also inflict some elemental impairment. Nymph is the first 6-star primal caster, an archetype introduced alongside the first 6-star ritualist, Virtuosa. Nothing particularly interesting about their stats build. They are clearly a derivative from core casters with very similar stats all across the board. Same interval, same DP, same range, and are both single target by default. Thanks to the ingenious global server translation, let's quickly review the difference between elemental impairment and damage. Impairment is an unofficial term used by the community. It's the damage to the EHP bar, the ring. Archetypes that typically deal impairment are Ritualist and Primal Defender. The latter one isn't in global yet, so imagine enemies are canned food and impairment dealers are like can openers. They are efficient in triggering bursts since they deal impairment based on their attack, but they don't deal direct elemental damage, like how you wouldn't use the can opener to eat what's inside. Elemental damage, on the other hand, is damage to the actual HP bar, and Primal Caster is the typical dealer. Now, they do usually have some degree of ability to also do impairment, but when they do, it's based on their damage dealt, meaning that it has to go through enemy defensive stats like resistance or damage reduction, which makes sense. Imagine Primal Casters are spoons or forks. You can perhaps scratch the can, but you don't really use them to open cans. However, they can directly deal elemental damage, usually during bursts. So the principle is very clear. Impairment dealers induce bursts, opening up the can for primal casters to deal damage, eating what's inside the can. And yes, there is a Swiss knife situation, aka Logos with his Delta module, but what can I say? Logos is Logos. Nymph is a Necrosis primal caster, just like how we specify Virtuosa as a Necrosis ritualist. Necrosis burst induces a 800 E DPS and a linearly recovering 50% enfeeble that lasts for 15 seconds. To remind you, different elements are currently competitive, and primal casters and all the various Delta modules only deal elemental damage during the burst of their corresponding elemental type. So if you open the can with a Necrosis opener, burn openers and spoons are both denied access for 15 seconds. Some sort of OCD, I guess. Necrosis as an element, based on the current design trend, is observed to be more for E damage itself. They come with a longer damage window, 15 seconds versus the 10 seconds for burn, and they typically have a longer cycle compared to the burst damage nature of burn. Next, let's look at Nymph's talents. Talent 1, when attacking enemies under the burst effect of Necrosis damage, deals an additional 40% attack as elemental damage per second, lasting until the end of the Necrosis burst. The burst doesn't need to be triggered by Nymph, she just needs to hit the enemy for the effect. If it is triggered by her though, the damage that triggers the burst will apply this talent, which is QOL. The talent is applied as a DOT E damage that is calculated alongside the 800 E DPS of Necrosis burst itself, and the effect will be removed immediately when Nymph leaves the field. This is an easy to apply extra damage to the Necrosis burst DOT and can be boosted by attack multipliers in skills. Normally it's 308.8 to 382.9 extra EDOT and can go up to 1062.2 during skill 3, which is more than double the original Necrosis DOT and is low-key quite deadly. Talent 2, whenever a Necrosis burst is triggered in Nymph's range, attack plus 2%, stacking up to 10 times, 12 times at potential 5. This stacking effect is applied as a direct multiplier. Again, the burst doesn't have to be triggered by Nymph herself, but it does require the target to be in her range when the burst happens. What sucks though is that if the enemy die from the blow that's supposed to trigger the burst, it doesn't count because Necrosis damage is processed after arts damage. The quality of a stacking talent depends on how strict the condition is. While this isn't as bad as Dusk's on kill stacking, it isn't easy either, since we said in the Archetype breakdown, Nymph as a primal caster doesn't do impairment as efficient, so outside of skill 2, she will have a hard time stacking up the talent herself, with skill 3 giving her literally zero ability to do impairment. Therefore, it's still largely reliant on a ritualist, especially if you are looking for a full stack. Overall, this talent is most stackable on her own with skill 2 and is also most impactful in skill 2 due to the high transfer rate and being an attack scale skill. On skill 1 and skill 3 though, it becomes highly diluted by the inherent attack multipliers, making the bonus less relevant. Nymph doesn't have a module yet, so let's take a look at her skills. Skill 2 is a crowd control oriented skill loading the latest Fear status. It's highly effective against enemies who have a shorter attack range than Nymph herself, and comes with decent coverage. Permastore is possible with a handful of dual combo, or solo with the help of some relics in CC. It also allows her to work with her talents best in a solo scenario, with some degree of AoE like a skill 2, so it's more applicable in daily as well. Skill 3 provides a 2-target elemental damage with a scarily high total damage, but demands a ritualist or, realistically, virtuosa for the full potential. That said, it's highly effective against the increasing amount of damage reduction mechanics in the game. Skill 1 is just the ordinary hybrid skill of primal casters, not recommended. You may as well just use logos. Skill 1 attack plus 110%, attacks deal an additional 15% of arts damage as necrosis damage. If the target is under the burst effect of necrosis damage, deal an additional 50% attack as elemental damage. This is a 20/30, 20-second auto skill. Numbers are in talent 2 0 stack versus full stack. Nothing outstanding, while arts plus the E damage can be decent, we need to look at the actual performance. The skill is similar to how caster delta modules function, with a higher transfer rate at 15% compared to 8% that are commonly found in those modules. However, unlike Logos, who we said thrived on the module because how good his damage is, Nymph's skill 1's damage is just average. She needs 4 hits to trigger burst on a 0 resistance non-boss enemy. She's single target and only attack 13 times during the skill. So for enemies with higher resistance or damage reduction, she's quickly crippled. Not to mention bosses have double the EHP and she can spend the whole skill cosplaying Haze and not triggering burst at all. In conclusion, okay cycles and startup, but just ineffective. Inferior to skill 2 and skill 3, not recommended. Skill 2 deals 400% attack as arch damage to the target and inflicts fear for 5 seconds, also dealing an equal amount of arch AoE splash damage in a 1.5 radius. Both instances deal an additional 25% of arch damage dealt as necrosis damage. If the target hit is in necrosis burst, the damage dealt by the Helm 1 increases to 100% of attack. Can store 2 charges, this is a 9/12 manual skill. The damage pattern is simple. There's a main target who gets the fear and 2 instances of 400% attack damage, and all the other splash targets only get 1 instance of that damage. So for the main target, it's double the amount of DPH and impairment shown here. And that means a 1-hit burst for non-boss enemies under 35 or 47 resistance, depending on talent 2 stacks. Let's introduce Fear first. Fear is a brand new crowd control status. Description says, cannot be blocked and runs off uncontrollably. But we'll go more technical than that in just a sec. Fear immunity does exist, but is currently rarely found in the game. It doesn't affect enemies that are not moving, like big bosses such as Sui Xiang and Quintus. It also doesn't affect those who move by teleporting, like the Witch King or Mephisto the Singer. Others include all sorts of non-moving equipment and, for some reason, Crady, which is the only one who moves normally in this list. So rest assured, if an enemy can walk, they are usually prone to fear. For interactions, it's a status effect that can be resisted by enemies who have resistance, where the duration will be halved. Although unspecified in the description, its duration can also be prolonged by crowd control related relics in IS, which is a very significant advantage for her. Ever since its introduction, it has become evidently clear that fear, especially by Nymph skill 2, is extremely oppressive against melee enemies, or generally speaking, enemies who have a shorter range than Nymph, as she can easily kite them forever. Let's break down how it works in full. When applied, the game would first create a fear zone by drawing a vector in the direction extending from Nymph towards the target, then creating a 90-degree sector, 45-degree to both sides of the vector, with a 10-tile radius. So, within this sector, tiles that fulfill the following requirements are marked as potential destinations. 1. They have a viable path towards the target's destination, the blue box, so it will exclude tiles that are in an area completely sealed off from the objective, including ones that can be reached via a portal. 2. The tile must be passable, obviously, and it will not select blue boxes themselves or holes in the ground. After confirming the fear zone, the game will randomize a temporary checkpoint for the fear target to move to. It's done by further marking tiles in the fear zone that can be reached within a pathing distance of 5 from the starting point, which means that they are within a Manhattan distance of 5 and it cannot involve portals. The game then randomly selects one of the tiles that meets the condition and set it as the fear destination. It's then further randomized by dropping the exact destination randomly within a 0.5 tile size square centered in that tile. So sometimes you'll see enemies moonwalking within one tile. That's when they have no available tile that can meet the 5 pathing distance requirement, and the game selects the tile that they are already on. After reaching the first destination, the game repeats step 2 again, and the target will reveal tiles that it can reach within 5 steps, find a new destination to go after, rinse and repeat until fear wears out. So, for enemies who only have the one tile they are on as the available destination, they will just wander on and on within this 0.5 tile side box, because however they repeat, they can only find a new random spot in this half of a tile. But remember, the fear zone doesn't change until the enemy is given a new fear effect, where the game will redraw the sector and refreshes the zone and possible destinations. The same goes for when multiple fear effects are stacked and one of them wears out. There are some additional points to look out for though. First, if enemy passes by or is on their preset checkpoints when affected by fear, their idle timer will continue to tick down during fear and will stay idle at the fear destination when fear wears out, until the idle timer on that checkpoint is over. Also, even though the fear zone determination would not include objective points, an enemy might still enter the objective during fear if 1. That blue box is their destined objective, 2. They have no more checkpoints to reach before the objective, and 3. Their fear pathing crosses with the objective, which is a 0.05 radius circle at the center of the blue box. For example, in this diagram, if the target's destination is randomized to be like this, then it will enter the blue box as it tries to move to the fear destination. If it's a little bit off like this instead, it will stay away from the prompt circle and pass through the blue box. That's all the mechanics. Let's talk about practice. First, it has decent coverage. In an ideal scenario, for example, a narrow pathway, 5-second fear means that the enemy will go away from Nymph for 5 seconds, which takes them another 5 seconds to walk back to the same tile, so that is 10 seconds stalled. On the other hand, skill 2 is a 12 SP skill with a 33 frame SP lockout, so the ideal coverage is 10 over 13.1 seconds at 76% with just about a 3-second gap. So that opens up a lot of perma-stall options. You can go with SP buffs like Telopsis and Mostima to shorten her cycle, or use other CC like Norse's skill 2 or Dorothy's skill 2, let the enemy walk away but stall them as they start to walk back. There are a lot of selections. Here are some of my experiences as tips. Try to use it in narrow terrains or put Nymph at choke points instead of wide open areas to control the angle of Nymph towards her target, which is important in the determination of the fear movement. Make sure enemies will always return to Nymph's attack range after they recover from the movement to avoid breaking the store chain. And finally, how about using it in daily, where we evaluate more on damage. Like we said, the 1-hit burst threshold is 35 to 47 resistant to non-boss enemies, which is nice. Just note that if arts damage is negated by shield or barrier or dodge, the impairment will not occur, but the fear will go through. It is the skill that allows her to make use of both talents independently the most. Talent 1 is triggered on burst and comes with an amplified scale at 100%. The splash damage may allow her to burst more enemies with AoE, which is good for stacking up talent too. Overall, this is the skill you may want to use if you are not going for the Ritualist Primal Caster duel. Its AoE ability is welcomed, but in terms of mob killing, really isn't as efficient as Aya's skill 2 since she has longer cycle, and worse off is a manual skill. And as a hybrid damage skill, there's no standout advantage in the damage quality. Against high resistance enemies, she may not be able to cause impairment fast enough to trigger talent 1, and against low resistance, you may as well use your traditional arts damage dealers. Skill 3, attack range expands, attack plus 220%, attack speed plus 60, attacks 2 targets at the same time. If the target is in necrosis burst, attacks deal elemental damage instead. This is a 36/55 35-second skill. The extended attack range is the same as marksman's. Numbers are as follows. Her attack interval shortens to 1 second during skill, so DPH and DPS is 2655.7 max. Total direct damage, meaning that the necrosis DOT and her talent 1 dot is not included, is about 93k, with a talent 1 DPS at about 1k. It's easy to tell that this skill is a pure damage skill, nothing flashy. One key difference from the typical arts and element hybrid design though is that the arts to element ratio in the skill is either 0 to 100 or 100 to 0. Nymph also has 0 ability to deal impairment in this skill, so good news is that her entire focus is on pushing out more E damage. Bad news being that a ritualist is mandatory for the damage window. I really wouldn't recommend using the skill just for arts damage, in case some of you might be thinking that way. This skill, arts damage wise, is a complete stomp by Logo's skill 3, worse in damage, attack count, attack range, cycle, startup, so please, no. To use this skill, her best enablers are the Necrosis Ritualists, and realistically Virtuosa. Skill 3 is the skill to go for, with mostly matching duration and cycle, range that is easier to cooperate with. Skill 3 can trigger bursts fast and in an AoE fashion to help Nymph stack up her talent, and the Elemental Fragile that comes with her module is a massive bonus, expected in 3 months. As a side note, you can use Vala Queen, the Welfare from IS4 as the budget choice, but her burst time and duration doesn't match well enough. What Nymph and Virtuosa can do is the highest and most consistent E damage in the game as of now. And since E damage is currently used as a counter to all the prevalent high defense, resistance, damage reduction enemies, it also stands out a lot when compared to true damage dealers who are in the same race, especially in terms of damage potential. Let's take a look at the comparison with some of the damage duels in the game currently. All operators involved in this comparison, except Nymph, comes with module level 3. So, apparently, Nymph and Virtuosa duel is almost unaffected by enemy resistance, and most importantly, damage reduction as well. The x-axis here is resistance, and operators like Logos or Serta do come with resistance shred or ignore, but they can't do anything about damage reductions. That's where the duel stands out. That said, there are also cons that the graph may or may not tell you. First, they do start with lower starting damage, so at lower resistance, they may be less competitive. That has a lot to do with the 2 target count as well, where the others have 3 or 4. But most importantly, the crowd control from Virtuosa is a bit lacking compared to Suzerain or Saria skill 3. Damage is important, but so is the environment that facilitates the damage. Lastly, an interesting observation here is that Nymph plus Logos does come with higher total damage than Nymph plus Virtuosa below 60 resistance, or you should say effective resistance. This is more significant in buff game modes like IS, where Virtuosa gaining more attack only translates to a 1 to 2 second faster burst, while Logos is straight up outputting more damage while causing bursts faster. That's why in IS5, most players will go with Logos then Nymph in the team environment and withdrawing Virtuosa from the pick meta. Looking further, we can still find potential for the duel at high resistance even against trios. However, there's currently no good candidate for the 3rd member in an elemental damage trio. They just don't synergize and use every bit of their kits as well as the trios used in this comparison. This is due to the lack of E damage related supports other than Virtuosa. Normal Fragile from Suzerain doesn't buff E damage, so supporters like Suzerain can only serve for her crowd control. For Nymph herself, she's not high on buff potency either due to the high inherent attack and attack speed increases. To wrap up, here's a more complete graph. My personal take, if you're looking for a third member, you should pick Logos when lacking damage or Suzerain when lacking crowd control. So all in all, Nymph is a 6-star primal caster that comes with 2 clear utilities, her Fear crowd control and her potential to deal pure elemental damage. Her talent revolves around benefiting from necrosis bursts. Skill 2 is self-functional and has proven dominant against enemies that cannot reach her in time. Skill 2 is the skill with the highest damage potential in the true or pseudo-true damage race, but needs a ritualist to help her with that. For performance, since her debut, well, if you hate stage gimmicks like pushing the bomb to Lucario to get rid of his damage reduction, you can use Nymph Virtuosa combo to brute force them. She's pretty popularly picked in IS4 and 5 pre-expansion 1, mostly for her skill 2 Fear. It's an easy solo store with any of SP relics, hand relic, or crowd control time relics. Sometimes she's also used for the skill 3 E damage. Her skill 2 was again used in the CCB 3 that has just concluded. It was used to stall the final field enemies, even though she's not in the final 7 ops max risk roster. In terms of rating, I have her at 5 for daily. Her kit and how she functions really says that she's not exactly built for casual contents. She doesn't have AFK skills, and the more daily friendly skill 2 being a manual trigger every 12 seconds. And it doesn't have any defining advantage against AFK skills like Aya skill 2, the old school, or Logo skill 1, the newer school, or Marcio skill 2, which is coming next month. Skill 2 does have some degree of AoE and have better damage quality if a necrosis burst can be triggered, but that is still not up to par with Logo skill 1. Skill 3 can be used to bypass the prevalent damage reduction mechanics on bosses with the help of Ritualist. Easy cheat code. For Advanced, however, I would have her at 8, and with CCB 3 concluding, she could end up being like 8.5 even. Her speciality, Fear crowd control with skill 2, and 2 target high E damage when enabled by Ritualists. Her skill 2 benefits greatly from IS relics and can easily pull off full Fear coverage solo, and is very strong in gameplay. You don't have to time it strictly and can just spam the skill. While skill 3 can counter damage reduction enemies, which is present on all of the ending bosses. It benefits less from relics, as there are currently no direct buffs to E damage. Fear is also a very cost-effective way to perma-store a target with a lot of dual partners, and has seen actual use in CCB 3 with Mostima. And if in future CC where there are damage reduction enemies that do not have massive defense, Nymph has a chance to become the main damage dealer in place of KOB. Overall, in advanced contents, crowd control is always superior than damage, hence the priority on her skill 2. But since Nymph has both cards in her arsenal, she still has great potential in advanced gameplay. For numbers, her skill 2 cycle at 12 SP is really good and supports her viability a lot. Skill 3 does have a long startup and cycle, but since it's in line with her dual partner, Virtuosa skill 3, it becomes less of a concern. At least the damage number is solid. Again, I'm just gonna quickly go over all the pull or build analysis. The reasoning are pretty much explained earlier in the breakdown as well. One key problem with her potential in gameplay is that the element system, although still rapidly growing, is still only having limited pieces unlike the Arts army. So like we analyzed in skill 3, her high E damage potential has a high floor but low ceiling. There's not a lot of operators or buffs that can further boost her damage. For schedule and meta, one thing I need to point out is that if you want to prep for her skill 3 damage, make sure you have Virtuosa or is planning to get her 3 months later. It's not just some ordinary duel, Virtuosa is basically a must. That's all for this episode. Thank you all for watching until the end. Despite the banner having already ended, I hope you learned something from the episode, and hopefully I can recover from the delay next month. Nothing much to report here, so see you in the next video. Bye bye.